Hello, good morning, everybody. My name's Beth Yates, and I am the Children's Consultant from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. I'm going to be your host, your question moderator, and a presenter for today's webinar, which is called Where's My Cape? Managing a Youth Services Department. And I have three guest presenters alongside me today. We've got Elissa Morgan of the Morgan County Public Library, Cathy OLeary of the Mooresville Public Library, and Cathy Riley of the Hancock County Public Library. All three are youth services managers, and they'll tell you a little bit more about their background when we get started here in just a minute. But before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. The first one is regarding sound. If you're having any sound issues on your end during the webinar, please see the sound issues box just below the chat box. It's on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. If you're unable to resolve the sound issue that you're having, rest assured that we are recording the webinar and you can watch it offline after it has ended. But if there's a global sound issue, meaning everybody's having the problem, we will announce it in the chat box. So you'll know if that's happening. Otherwise, assume it's just you. And check the volume on your individual computer too, because that can be an issue. If you have a question during the webinar, you can type it in that chat box on the upper left-hand side of your screen. I'm going to be keeping an eye on that chat box, and we will address your question as soon as we can. If we are not able to address it immediately, we do plan on having an open time for questions towards the end, and we'll talk more about that here in a minute also. Just a heads up that today's session is a little longer than usual. It's set for 75 minutes as opposed to 60. It is worth one LEU, and your LEU certificate will be available for download at the end of the webinar. So if you're watching an archived recording of this presentation in the future, information on how to obtain your LEU will be in the video's description on YouTube, so you can look for it there. On a related note, today's webinar will be recorded and archived. After the webinar has been transcribed, it will be available on the Indiana State Library's archived webinars page. For weekly updates on upcoming trainings and to learn more about what's happening in libraries across the state, please subscribe to the Indiana State Library's e-newsletter, The Wednesday Word, and check our continuing education website for other professional development opportunities. Finally, I do want to ask for your patience today because we have 4 presenters and 1 microphone, so there'll be a little bit of shuffling. We will try to make our transitions as smooth as possible, but we beg your forgiveness in advance. All right, so I think we're ready to get started. I'm going to switch over to our presentation here. And wait for it to pull up. There it is. It's called Where's My Cape? Managing a Youth Services Department. And first we're going to introduce ourselves. Again, my name's Beth Yates. I'm the Children's Consultant at the Indiana State Library, but my background is actually as a Children's Librarian and Department Manager. I was at the Johnson County Public Library for about 12 years, and I was a manager there for about 8 years. And during that time, I managed between 2 and 3 people, most of the time about 3 people. So we were a small department, not the smallest, not the largest, kind of a middle-sized department. Our next person is Elissa Morgan.
Hello, my name is Elissa Morgan. I am the Children's Librarian at the Morgan County Public Library. Yes, you're reading that right. The last name and my library are all the same. I have worked at Morgan County since 2009. I actually started there as an intern while I was in library school, was hired as a circulation clerk, and then in 2011 I became the children's librarian and head of my department. In my department there are 2 full-time people, myself and the teen librarian. I have a staff of 5 part-time people and 1 unmanageable rabbit. So that's kind of what things are like with me and my staff.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. Next up, we have Cathy OLeary.
Hi, everybody. My story actually mimics Alyssa's quite a bit, which I didn't realize until now. I also started at Mooresville Public Library in 2011 as an intern. I was then hired for a part-time circulation position. Then I left to take a position at another library and then returned in 2012 to become the Director of Youth Services. Several years ago, my job title was expanded to include all library programs, so I oversee both youth and adult programming. I currently manage a staff of one full-time teen librarian who we share with a local middle school. I also have 2 part-time staff members, and I also supervise a teen page who works about 10 hours a week, and that's me.
Awesome. And last but not least, we have Cathy Riley.
Hi, I'm the Youth Services Manager at Hancock County Public Library. I was a children's librarian for about 7 years, and now I've been a manager for almost 7. My department is divided between 2 locations, our main library at Greenfield and then our branch at Sugar Creek, and we are a department of 11. At Greenfield, there are 7 of us. 5 of us are MLS librarians, and I have 2 part-time. Out at our branch, we've got 3 librarians and 1 part-time.
All right, thanks guys. Now that you know who we all are, what are we here trying to do? Our objective for this webinar is, we can't answer every single question in an hour and 15 minutes, but we are going to try and hit some of the most common questions and topics that new managers and old managers, experienced, not old, experienced managers also might face. And our goal is to give you our perspective on these things. Along the way, we've picked up, we've been trained, many of us, in how to do managing, but this is also just life experience and professional experience. So we're going to give you some tips and some suggested best practices for managing a youth services department that we hope you will find useful. So the structure for this webinar is a Q&A style. So about a couple months ago, we put out a call for questions from people who wanted to know things about being a youth services manager. And we received over 20 questions altogether, I think. So we got together and we kind of drilled into those questions and figured out what are some of the most common topics that people are wondering about. And so we picked sample questions from those that we're going to answer today. Then at the end, for the last 15 minutes or so, we hope to save that time for live questions from you guys. So if we don't address a question that you have burning away, feel free to ask that at the end, okay? And that kind of brings me also to our little disclaimer here, and that's just if any of you out there submitted a question and you don't hear us ask it today, first of all, know that we may have edited it, or there may have been similar questions to it, so hopefully we'll address it. But if we don't address it, again, feel free to ask that question at the end if you like, or you can always email me or one of us if it's something that you don't want people to attach to your name, if it's a private matter. So feel free to do that too. We'll give you our email address at the end. Okay, let's get started. The first section, the first topic that we're going to talk about is how to share your story, because we had a few questions about how to make sure that administration and colleagues understand what Children's Services does and why we're valuable and important, because sometimes I think youth services feels a little undervalued. Hopefully that's not the case where you are, but it is unfortunately sometimes the case for people. So we're going to start with Cathy and see what she has to say. Oh, well, first let's do our first question. The first question regarding this is, how can we help administration and other departments understand the amount and the scope of the work that we do? So,
Okay. We work in youth services because we're passionate and focused on youth and literacy. But when we're advocating for youth in our departments, we're talking to people and staff who have other focuses. So if you feel that lack of interest, tie your message into one of theirs. Shift the conversation from "you aren't hearing me" to "I'm aware of your responsibilities and tasks for your starter conversation." A conversation that shows your awareness of their time and priorities but how youth services ties in.
Right, so that you can gain their empathy and they know that you are interested in them too and understand, right? Alyssa, what's your 2 cents?
My 2 cents. So, a lot of us are used to sort of sharing what we're doing formally, be it through the stats we keep of programs, monthly reports to the board that sort of list programming we've done over the past month, or our accomplishments. But I also find an informal sharing helps as well. So if my director or the library board president happens to stroll in while I'm cutting out Yeti flannels for a story time, and they ask, why are you cutting out Yeti flannels for a story time? I tell them this is for my story time program. This is what I've been working on. And also I've got 2 staff members who are out doing school visits, and I have another one who's in the back prepping for this program. So actually just telling them what it is you guys are doing is also another way to share your story, and probably maybe the easiest way of all.
Yeah. And then Casey.
Sometimes I have a lot of support from my administration and my colleagues at my library. I also find, though, that if I want to really show the value of what I do and what we as a department do, I go straight to the patrons. I save every thank you note. I save every stack of thank you letters from a class after I do something. I sat in on a department heads meeting this week, and I brought an envelope with a group of thank you notes from a 2nd grade class for a outreach program that I did. And I'm able to show my director and also my colleagues specifically the benefit of the work that we're doing as a department. My patrons can be my greatest allies and my greatest supporters, and I just let them do the talking, and I say thank you, and I hang on to everything, every drawing that a child makes for me, and I share that with the administration and the board so they understand the value of what we're doing.
Awesome. And I love that, because also if you've heard the word outcomes floating around, measuring how we're being effective with our programming and our services in our community, that's an excellent demonstration, a physical demonstration of how you're having an effect on someone's life, is by saving those cards and the artwork and things that people give you. So my input on this one is that if you do want to keep track of how much you're doing, in addition, of course, to keeping statistics on program numbers and things like that, consider having your staff and yourself do some sort of time study. And that's basically just keeping track of how much time you're spending on different tasks. You do it over a couple of days or maybe 1 week. It's not forever. And you break it down into the different types of tasks that you're doing. If you Google time study, you will come up with some examples for how to do that. But it's a really great way if you're trying to show your administration just how busy you are, that you can give them a concrete example. Show them exactly how busy, and that, if you need new staff or if you need to cut back on something, that's how you can show why. Okay, let's do our next question. And that's, how would you handle adult services programmers creating programming for children and teens without consulting the youth services department? And I know this is a pretty specific question, but I think this is the sort of kind of interdepartmental question that a lot of you might find, situations where maybe you feel like people are stepping on the toes of the children's department. So I'm going to take this one real quick first. And mine's mostly about communication, just making sure that you have open lines of communication between departments. I don't think there's anything wrong at all with saying, hey, I noticed that you've been planning a lot of youth-centric programs, and we'd like to be involved in that, because that's really our area of expertise over here in the children's department. You might also need to start with diplomacy, and if you have a supervisor or even go to your director above you, I think that this is a message that probably needs to come from the top. It needs to be a directive for the whole library, so you all know what is the programming that you're supposed to do, where is the division of duties. Does your director not care about a division of duties? Do they want you all to be doing everything? That's a whole nother story, right? So it's something where you definitely have to make sure everyone in the library is on the same page. Cathy also is going to chime in here.
Okay, so partnering, I see that as a completely separate issue. If they're asking your department to solely run these programs, don't be afraid to say no. And that's easy to say, it's harder to put into practice, but we're talking about protecting your department's time. And also, it's fun to brainstorm program ideas, but with that comes the responsibility of owning all the work of putting that program on. To tie back into Beth's suggestion, in that particular conversation, I would also extend that to why. Why are they creating youth-centric programs? Do they see gaps in our programming lineup? Do they feel like they are addressing specific needs in the community? Or librarians, gather more information on why.
Yeah, and then how can you address that? Fantastic. Any questions, you guys, about sharing your story with directors and staff? You can type those in the chat box, but we're going to go on to our next topic, which is change management. This is another big one, especially if you're a new director, because you might come in with lots of ideas of things you'd like to change. So 2 of the questions we had about this were, if you are a new manager, what is the best way to get staff on board with a new vision or changes you'd like to make, especially if they've been doing things one way for many years? We all know situations like this. And then the other question is, how can I get staff interested in trying new things and trends in librarianship and libraries? So, Casey, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. When I came in as a new manager, I had 2, a full-time and a part-time staff member. The part-time staff member had been at the library for 11 years, and one of her favorite phrases was, well, we've always done it like this. And I had a hard time with it. I had a very hard time with it. I took it very personally. It wasn't it's not a particularly welcoming phrase or collaborative phrase, but it was coming from a place of experience, and experience goes a long way. My full-time person was brand new, no library background, and was willing and interested in changing every single thing. And so it was nice to have that drive behind some of the changes too. I think the most important thing to ask myself, first and foremost, is why am I changing something? Am I changing it just to do things differently? Am I changing it to separate myself from the person who had the job before me? Am I changing things because the community is legitimately asking for it? Am I changing something because I worked at another library and it was very successful there and I'd like to implement it in my new surroundings? If I have a why, it's much easier, I think, to get people on board. As the youth services director, sometimes people are not going to like the decisions that I make. But again, if I have a why behind it and I feel strongly about it, I think I'm a better advocate for those things. In terms of getting staff interested, for example, we brought in some new technology into the children's department. We had, during one of our staff training days, a petting zoo for our technology, which is actually an idea that I stole from Beth when she came and did one for a youth services roundtable. But I had the staff try all these different tools that we had, so they'd be a little more comfortable and they'd feel a little more confident. And everybody had a really good time. So I also, with change, I have to remember that change takes time and that I have to be willing to support the staff as much as I would like them to support me.
That's a good point. Yeah. And we had a nice comment from Bethany. She says, at our library, we call this behavior/thought process gatekeeping. It's a constant challenge to overcome and get people to think in new ways. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, we like to fall back on what we're comfortable with, right? Yes. So, Alyssa, what's your thoughts on this?
Kind of to tie into a few things Casey said, when you start, you can't change everything at once. It's not good for your own mental health to do that. Also, especially if you're coming in because you're brand new to the library system or new to the community, they might be on their guard and waiting for you to change absolutely everything. When I became the manager of my department, I had worked there for almost 2 years as a circulation clerk and a programming specialist. So I sort of came in with the unique perspective of I had seen how things were going and what I wanted changed. And I had a big, long list. But the first 2 things I did, because I decided we're going to do 2 and we'll see how this goes. First thing were with library cards. Our library is 2 levels, adult upstairs, children downstairs. And previously the children's department was told not to issue cards to adult patrons. I said no, because most people come in to our door first before they go upstairs. We are the first face they see. We want to be as welcoming as possible. So we will be doing be doing library cards for everyone. The next thing I changed was a programming date. We had been doing a series of baby time on Friday for 8 weeks, and then for the following 8 weeks, we would do toddler time at the exact same time. It was confusing to staff, it was confusing to patrons, so I said, let's just split them and give them each their own day. We did those things. I waited a couple months. Everyone was on board, and I said, great, I want to try to do an evening program. Oh, we've tried that before. Nobody ever comes to them. I'm like, okay, well, how long has it been since you tried it? Do you have ideas on why you think it may not have been successful before? So at that point, I was trying to get their buy-in and their opinions to see how we could improve things. Sometimes asking for someone else's opinion can be dangerous, but oftentimes it is extremely helpful.
Yeah. That was just a quick comment from Beth again. That was one of my biggest strategies, was asking for the input from my department on that. And Cathy, I think you're also going to talk about this.
You're reading my mind, because my first part is, ask your staff. We've been very successful when we have our department meetings. We brainstorm together. What I love about that is we also brainstorm our programming. And so it's not like just one person's perspective. You get all these different perspectives. You get a range of topics. It keeps you well-rounded. And sometimes staff is comfortable contributing, sometimes they're not. But what you always want to do is create that opportunity for staff buy-in. And also, if they're passionate about it, then put their name next to the initiative. Have them partner with you or run that particular goal. Just as sort of like with programming, if you suggest it, you're responsible for it, but that's not to say you don't partner with them and provide the training and the support. That's always important. And dare I mention summer reading real quick? I know. What I love about it is when we have a big program like that, we come back at our next department meeting and we talk about what works and what doesn't, and creating that environment where everybody feels safe saying, hey, this didn't work. And not that we don't want to address it. We want to. It's like, so what are our options for changing that so it's better next year? When you are new, it is easy to see what you want to change. But the longer you're in the position, what I have found is you get very used to what the routine is. So then I found it's important for me to listen closely to new staff members because they have a fresh perspective. Listen closely to what they have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. All right, so again, if you have any questions about change management, feel free to type them in there, and we will make sure we get to those questions at the end. And we're going to move on to our next topic now, which is time management, delegation, and burnout. Yay, burnout. So we had quite a few questions on this. Here's an example of 3. The first one is, how do you prioritize tasks when each one seems important? How do you find time to get your own job duties done while also fielding questions, concerns, etc. from your staff, which is definitely something you have to learn how to balance when you move from being a staff member to a management position. And then I'm told to delegate more, but I feel personally responsible for tasks. So how do I decide what to delegate and what to keep, and how do I follow up with staff without micromanaging? And I'm going to go first on this one. I think that the first 2 questions here really feed into the third one, because the answer that I'd give to the first 2 is you got to delegate. You really have to practice some self-care here if you don't want to burn out personally. And part of that self-care is learning to let other people help you. So I know we often feel a lot of responsibility as managers to do everything because ultimately it does fall on our shoulders. It's our responsibility to make sure the department is working well. But you just can't do everything. Sometimes it might actually mean sacrificing doing something that you really love. Now, obviously, you're not going to delegate tasks like probably not scheduling, definitely not things like performance appraisals and things like that. But when it comes to your other kind of random tasks and duties, look at them, see which ones you like, and somebody else might like doing that too. And ultimately, it gives your staff a chance to grow and learn and kind of gain more responsibility in the department. So they become a more well-rounded staff member and librarian. Kathy.
Okay, so delegation often means training, and training takes time, usually when your time is the tightest. But it is really worth it to carve out this time because it balances out your to-do list. Like Beth said, ask yourself, am I the only one who can do this? If you aren't, that's your answer. And your staff isn't going to do it the same way you do it, but that's fine. That's also another opportunity to reevaluate what happened, and it's another training opportunity. And delegation, if you aren't comfortable with delegating, you need to take a couple of minutes and ask yourself why not.
Yeah. Alyssa.
Okay, you've done it. You found the perfect staff person. You have delegated a task. Now you've got to do the hard part. Walk away. This is easier said than done. It will take practice, but you can do it. They're not going to complete the task successfully if you are hovering over them. It makes no sense for you to have delegated the task in the first place if you are hovering over them. When I was first starting to delve into the delegating waters, I would go as far as to write on my calendar, you cannot ask person A about project X until such date. And it worked, and now I've gotten to a place where I can give someone a task. I tell them, if you need anything at all, please let me know. If you want me to help, I can do that. Then I walk away. You can do it. It will be fine.
And this is Beth again. I'm going to chime in one more time just to say, yes, I love the idea of setting reminders. I used to set reminders for the opposite problem, so I would remember to ask them about something because
Good point.
because you get busy with your own tasks. Also, I was in a situation where I had a lot of trust in my staff to get done what they needed to get done. They were professionals, and so I needed a reminder to check in with them and just make sure they were doing okay and did they need anything. The other thing you can do is set regular meetings with your staff. I'm addressing right now the how do I follow up without micromanaging. You can set individual meetings, maybe quarterly or bi-monthly, or better yet, maybe a department meeting, because a department meeting is a situation where you can ask everybody for updates on what they're working on without it feeling like you're breathing down a particular individual's neck. And then ultimately, when you do delegate that, you have to make sure you're setting some sort of timeline or frame for them so they understand what deadlines are when they need to have something done from the start. And then, there's less reason to have to breathe down their neck, right? So, all right, so let's go to the next question. This one's also in time management, but somebody asked, I see job postings for youth services librarians all the time. Is this because of burnout? If so, how do I avoid my staff and I burning out?
Okay, this is Alyssa again. We talked about this several times, and we're not totally sure if the reason the number of postings you see is truly because of burnout. There are a lot of factors involved in anyone looking for a new job. It can be because they've started a family and they're going to take a few years off from working. It could be because you're moving for whatever reason. You could also be looking for a job with higher pay because that's just how that works. And there are also, we also discussed this morning, there are also quite a few librarians who have reached retirement, which have opened up those positions. But that being said, it still is easy for us to get burned out because this is kind of a high-stress job. We're in a customer service industry. It's a stressful industry to be in, and we're often understaffed for the services that we hope to provide. So that's kind of a tricky question to ask.
Right. Yeah, a lot of times people think that we're just reading books all day, but it really is legit a stressful, any sort of customer service situation is a stressful job. Casey, what do you think?
It is a stressful job. I've had a very stressful week and it's only Wednesday. So I personally try to stay very aware of burnout. There were a number of webinars and trainings regarding burnout over the last couple of years, and I always take them because I feel like maybe I'm missing something, and if I figured out what that thing is, then I wouldn't feel burned out. But you just can't do everything. I can't do everything. I just can't. I actually was reading, I cannot for the life of me remember where I heard it, but I heard recently or read recently that it is reasonable that as we progress to a higher level of within our professional careers, that things do not necessarily get easier because we are, as we're moving up, taking on more responsibility. So if I take on a director position in youth services, it is going to be more challenging simply because I'm taking on more responsibility. And I don't know why my brain keeps saying this should be getting easier, because it doesn't. But I think burnout comes when there isn't a willingness to delegate and there's a feeling of I'm doing this all by myself. I'm right there right now. I've been 2 months down a staff member. I've been covering double the number of programs that I have in the past, and it's hard. It is very challenging. I think what I have to keep reminding myself is I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown. She's got a Netflix special called Call to Courage. I highly recommend it. But I was at the very end of it, she says something about if you're going to aim high, you're going to fail. And that it's assuming that I won't fail. I think burnout is, I don't think I should be failing, and because I'm failing, I'm just done. As opposed to, I failed because I tried, because I'm aiming higher and trying more. And failure just means I gotta back up, take a look at what I'm doing, and try again.
The first attempt in learning.
Yes.
Fail.
Yes. I'm still learning. That's the thing too. Like somehow when you become an administrator, you don't have to learn because you know everything. And basically, the longer I do this, I realize how much I don't know. So I think it's okay to just say I don't know, or I tried and it didn't work, but I'm willing to try again. So,
Cathy would like to chime in too.
You said Brene Brown, and I just had to lean in because I was reading one of her books, and I love the quote about ignoring the critics and the cheap seats. You got to pay attention to being down in the arena, trying your best, because that's where all the courage is.
I also just want to point out, I don't know if you said this, Casey, but if you're finding that you've delegated, you've done all you can, and everybody in your department is swamped and you're all getting burnt out, remember that it's okay to say no, and it's okay to cut back what you're doing. A lot of times we feel like we have to do everything that we're asked, that is asked of us, or everything that our community wants. And sometimes you have to make choices, and sometimes it is asking your community exactly what is their priority for us. What do they most want from us? And that can help us direct exactly what we put our time and energy into. Okay, and I see some people possibly typing. So go ahead, if you have any time management, delegation, or burnout questions, please put them in the chat box. Oh, here, Linda says, as someone nearing retirement, I experience burnout feelings because the job has changed. more babysitting, less respect for authority, keeping up with technology, and then there are sweet little hugs and thank yous to make it all better. Yeah, I think that's something we all experience. There's definitely the negatives, and then I would help somebody find a book that they really wanted and they'd be so happy, and it would make everything a little bit better, right? All right, if anybody has anything else to share about that, go right ahead, and we will move on to our next topic, which is dun dun dun, personnel issues. This is the sticky one. This is the one nobody really loves. Well, a few people might love it, but I don't know. I don't know why they do. Good for them, though. So some sample personnel issues questions, excuse me, are, as a supervisor, how do I give correction to an employee who doesn't take constructive criticism well? And also, I have an employee who gets upset when faced with any sort of criticism. How can I give her feedback without making her upset? I'm sure this is a question that is rolling around in everybody's mind. I think that first of all, let's recognize that it is never fun for you or for them when you have to deal with a difficult situation with a personnel issue, but it is necessary. I think it's important to set expectations personally about regular feedback from the start, so that it's not only used, you're not only giving them feedback when something is going wrong. So when I was a manager, I tried to meet with my department regularly, one-on-one. We usually did quarterly meetings if we could. And we discussed their progress on goals and any other questions or issues that they had. So, so that is one opportunity to address things. What I was trying to do was to create a culture where feedback was something that they regularly expected and received. And it could be positive or negative, hopefully mostly positive. Weigh the negative with the positive. And you have the opportunity then to say, I noticed that this thing has been happening, and I think it's something that you need to work on, kind of nipping it in the bud before it becomes a larger issue. Of course, remember, if it is a more urgent issue, then you do need to address it immediately, and definitely don't wait for that annual review to address it. I was told when I became a manager that any issues that you talk about in the annual review should have been mentioned earlier that year. It shouldn't come as a surprise to them. But yeah, try to notice things before they become those major issues, and then offer redirection or course correction for it by, well, my colleagues here are going to talk more about how. So, Casey.
I struggle with this because I am an employee who gets upset when faced with any sort of criticism. So offering criticism feels like I'm the bad guy in my head. So I've had to let go of that ultimately it's actually better, not just for the patrons or for me, it's actually better for the employee to address things rather than letting them go and fester. And so it has taken me a while to get comfortable with that. I think the most important thing to do, one of the most important things to do in any interaction regarding constructive criticism is to focus on what's expected and what is actually happening. So I've noticed that your programs are supposed to begin at 1 o'clock, and they always begin 5 minutes late. And the expectation is that the programs here begin on time, because that's what patrons deserve, and that's what the culture that we're trying to create. So let's talk about some ways that if you'd like to talk about why they're running 5 minutes late, we can do that. But let's come up with some ideas about how to make sure they start on time. So the focus is not on you're a terrible person because you're running 5 minutes late.
Right.
It's here's the expectation, here's what I'd like to see happen, how can we make that happen? Having said that, practice all interactions like this. If I have to have a hard conversation, I practice in my car. I go outside and walk around like a little bit of an odd person and practice out loud. I do it with somebody I trust at home, and just practice. A huge shout out to the website askamanager.com. which I think is in the references at the end of the webinar.
Yes.
Allison Green runs that website, and she is amazing at creating short, sweet, specific scripts for having difficult conversations. I love to talk, but I'm not very good at having those kind of conversations. So I have to practice. And when I do, it rolls right off the tongue, and we're good to go. But if I try to wing it, it's not pretty. So.
I just want to really quickly mention, Robert says that as a former educator and now librarian, I find that starting out with a positive comment and then following up with the issue addressing helps inform the employee or student that they have good qualities. However, everyone needs improvement. And Fran says, I find personally that I can handle criticism if I feel that my supervisors are giving positive feedback as well. It's unfortunate, but positive feedback doesn't come very often. I'm sorry, Fran. But yeah, I think you guys are absolutely right, because if they know that if your staff know that you are on their side and you're noticing the good things that they do, then hopefully those redirections, course corrections, as we like to call them, will not come down quite as bluntly. I don't know the word I'm looking for. Okay, so we have Cathy here.
Okay, so the part of the feedback discussion you can control your tone, your word choice, how you set up your department's environment for training and growth. And a lot of times the way I phrase it is, like, this is a growth experience, to put a positive spin on the training that we're then going to step into. The part you can't control is your employee's reaction or attitude. So Casey's right. You don't want to wing these kind of conversations. The other thing you want to do is you want to keep them short. You want to be clear about your expectations. You want to develop a plan. So it's not like, I just got this criticism and now I'm floundering. I don't know what to do. You're always moving on to that next step, and that's a positive feeling. And that helps deal with the emotions, because when you're having these conversations, your staff can have a range of reactions, from shutting down completely and not giving you any feedback. That's another reason to keep these conversations short. Or they can derail the conversation with excuses and denials. And that's how these conversations also spin out really long, where it's one excuse after another. And that's when you want to steer the conversation back to what you expect in this position with as few words as possible. You can say, I hear what you're saying. This is what we're addressing now, and keep it short.
Yeah, that's one of the hardest things. Also, make sure you're not taking it personally, right? Because it's not about you. If they're upset because you're asking them to do something that they don't want to stop doing, or whatever the situation is. Okay, let's see. I think we're ready for our next question. And they were, how do you manage disagreements between staff members? And how do you manage staff that don't like one another? How do you improve staff relationships with one another? So this was one that deals with interactions between staff. So Alyssa.
So anytime you're listening to anyone complain about anything, it can be that the style of construction paper is horrible, or the staff member has made such and such comment. It's important to ask the person that's telling you this if it's an issue they want you to do something about. Do they just need a moment to vent, which can get a little tricky because you don't want to encourage or participate in any kind of gossip. But sometimes somebody just needs to have a moment to say what they need to say, and then everything can move on. But if it's something that keeps coming up, at that point you need to ask the employee, is this something that I need to address with the other employee? Or if it's with an employee in another department, if their supervisor needs to address it. That kind of goes back to your own library's policy and how you handle things. We ran into a situation at my library where one of the adult staff was kind of making some comments to the children's staff about how our workload looks different than theirs and how it appears we don't do anything. And the first time I heard it, I thought it came off as a joke, but my employees were like, no, this happens more than what you would think. So at that point, I had to go to their supervisor and said, is this my time to handle it with this employee, or do you need to handle it? And we discussed it would be best for that supervisor to take on that situation. So,
And that's related back to our first question, right? Which is making sure everybody understands what your department does, if they care, right?
yes.
Casey.
It's a good idea in discussing one-on-one with a staff member a concern. Again, also making sure it's not just venting, because sometimes that needs to happen, and sometimes I can be a good sympathetic ear for somebody who has a concern. It's can be helpful to mirror back what you hear to the person who's bringing it up. So what I'm hearing is that you would prefer if so-and-so would not comment on how many songs you do in a story time, that it should be more or whatever. I think it's critically important at some point for people in any kind of administrative position to do some basic HR training, to know what the laws are, to know what the boundaries are legally. Because something that may not seem like a big deal to me could be a very big deal to the other person and could lead to some very big deal legal issues if not addressed. To just write something off as no big deal is doing a disservice not just to the employee but to the library as a whole. So I think some HR information. My director signed us up for a 2-day HR training, not library specific, and it was one of the best investments I think she could have made for me, because I had no idea legally what the boundaries are, and they change every 5 seconds. So
Right.
It's good to stay on top of those things and really make an effort to learn those things. And I think also when an employee says, please, I don't need you to say anything, I just wanted to tell you about it, respect that. I've been on the other end as an employee of talking to somebody and saying, I don't need you to follow up, I just wanted to bring you up to speed. And I leave the person's office and 5 minutes later there's an email doing exactly what I didn't want to happen. So if somebody says, I don't need you to follow up, it's okay to just sit with things for a minute. Not everything requires a knee-jerk reaction.
Right. Actually, this is a good time. Bethany had a question earlier about HR. She wondered, do you have a dedicated HR person to handle the most difficult issues? So I guess let's just real quick, everybody say.
This is Casey. We do not have an HR department, which again was the tremendous value of doing an HR training. At least it gave me something. But all HR issues are handled by administrators. We do have one staff person who is an attorney, but oftentimes even that can get problematic. We don't want that staff member to become the go-to for all HR concerns. It's a helpful resource, but it's really important that I put in the legwork because we don't have a separate person, which means we address everything ourselves.
Right. And at my old library, we did have an HR person, but I still found it really beneficial to be familiar with, like, what are some questions I can ask? What are some questions I should not ask my employees? Things like that. Alyssa.
Okay, we do not have an HR department. Our business manager is the unofficial human relations manager. She does an excellent job of keeping up with changes in the law. Our director also does an excellent job of that as well. And ultimately, if it comes down to it, the two of them work together to solve the issue. I personally tend to pay attention to a lot of the medical side of HR just because of things that I have in my department. So sometimes, if you don't want to get into the full HR, if you have specific things that you know you need to check on for your department, maybe focus in those areas.
Cathy.
Okay, at Hancock County, we do have HR, but what I take advantage of is our HR person does training at our management meetings, because a lot of times you'll have young staff and you need to have a basic understanding so you can advocate for your staff, because you can't explain something to a new hire if you don't understand it yourself.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go back to the 2 questions real fast. How do you manage disagreements and things like that? And this could kind of apply. Robert has asked a question that says, clicks can be a problem, especially in the small, medium library. How do you handle this? So what I'm going to say now, hopefully, maybe could apply to that. If a staff disagreement is really causing a major interruption to work or the dynamic in the department or the library, and again, if the clique by being kind of so tight with one another is causing a problem, then you might have to address it. So I would recommend that you invite them each to share privately if there's a disagreement with you, what their view of the issue is. And then tell them that you're going to hear both sides, and then you'll get back with them after you have a chance to process it and get both sides of the story. And then when you're doing it, make sure you're listening carefully to them. Make sure they feel heard, like Casey said. Repeat back to them what you're hearing. And then once you kind of determine, is this really an issue where one person's at fault, or is this just kind of a general disagreement or, miscommunication? Schedule a meeting again with each one of them and work on helping them to see the situation from the other person's viewpoint. If there's no real quote unquote culprit or bad guy here, just help them to communicate with one another by asking them questions like, what's something you could do to make this situation better? What do you think could be going on with her? What's making him act this way in your viewpoint? Again, separately, so you're not doing this when they're together. And then if somebody really has done something that's caused the problem, then you'll address that just like you would address any other personnel issue and come up with a plan. Say this is not professional, this is not how we should act. We have a certain standard that you need to get along professionally, at least. You don't have to like one another or be best friends, but you have to get along professionally. That's the expectation. So, Casey, you have something else to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to share first for Robert's question about clicks, which I think is such a great question. I work in a small medium library. I think that staff are always looking to the top to model appropriate behavior. So if I engage in cliquish behavior, it sets a tone and also a standard for the rest of the staff that they can do the same. If I try to model inclusivity and kindness to everybody, I do believe in my experience that filters down to the rest of the staff. And I just wanted to say to the question about suggesting something for an organization that does not have HR or resources concerning HR, our training was through Prior, Pryor, I think it's prior.com. They travel around the country and do trainings. They're in Indianapolis like every other minute doing training, and that is a great way to just get like an HR basics, and I think they do webinars too.
Thanks. Anybody else want to comment on the questions? Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to our next topic. We're doing pretty good on time. We want to keep moving. So the next one is organization, and somebody wanted to know, how do you manage the duties that staff have outside of programming? I'm going to take this question because we weren't 100% sure whether this question was looking for ways to keep track of schedules, like desk schedules and things, or if they want information about tracking larger projects. So I'm going to address how to track larger projects. At my library, first I kind of figured out what some of the major ongoing and special projects seem to be in my department. And let me just say that this took some time to do. I think I did not do it in my first year. You kind of, especially if you have not worked in that particular library before, if you're brand new to it, you might need some time to get a feel for the cycle of the year, because different things happen at different times of the year, right? So give yourself some time to observe it and then kind of make a list, keep track of what some of those duties are. And then I basically sat down with my department and said, here are the things that we need to make sure get done. What are some things, which ones of these things do you want to take care of? Do any of you volunteer to do this? And then if we didn't have volunteers, or if I thought someone would be very good for a particular duty or responsibility, then I would ask them personally to do it. And I would explain why I thought they would be good at doing that. If it comes to daily schedules, oh, and by the way, I just kept track of that in a Word document. You could do Excel, Word, you could maybe keep it on your Outlook calendar, whatever you're comfortable with. As for daily schedules, there are so many ways to keep track of desk schedules and things like that. The Association for Library Services to Children, ALSC, which is a subdivision of the ALA, they actually did a series of management webinars and leadership webinars that I have linked to on our resource document, and I'm going to share that document at the end of this webinar. And one of them actually talks about scheduling, so definitely try taking a look at that for more suggestions. In particular, the series called Leadership, I believe, is free for sure, so definitely check those out. Okay, I think we're ready for our last question. We saved this one for the end. It's because it's more general, and somebody wanted to know, what advice would you give to someone looking to be a youth services manager for the first time? So we're going to start with Cathy.
I think it's important to remember what you appreciated in your former managers and work on developing those skills. I really appreciated listening, honesty, the ability to train, and then try to develop those skills myself. The other part is, don't forget what it feels like to be a children's librarian, because that will help guide your actions. I remember wondering, like, there are problems. Why aren't they being taken care of? And sometimes when you become a manager, you see issues and you're like, boy, I hope nobody notices this, but I know they will, so here we go, let's take care of it. Your staff will appreciate that. It's not easy to address personnel issues, some of those what I call looking under the rock or swallowing the frog, but your staff will recognize that you are dealing with these issues, and they will appreciate it, and they will trust that you have their back. The other advice I say is, remember to be kind to yourself. You're going to make mistakes, and I can't always do this, but I try. If you wouldn't say it to your staff, don't say it to yourself.
That's a good point. Yes, be kind. Casey.
Yeah, that was really good. I like that, that last part. Beth alluded to this earlier. No, it's great, and I love to reiterate it, which is changing jobs is a major life change. It's on one of those lists, like, have you had a major life change in the last 12 months? And one of them is a job change. It's a major life change. So give yourself a year. I always say give it a year. Pace yourself. You don't have to do it all right at the beginning. You're not going to get asked to do it all right at the beginning. Your director or administration or board has brought you into this position because they feel like you're the right one for the job. So it's okay to sit with that and pace yourself. And also, every time you have a project, an event, a program, ask yourself, how does this meet the needs of the community and the patrons we serve? If you are bringing in a bunch of tech stuff, but the majority of your patrons don't have consistent or reliable internet at home, that may not be, and you want them to work on something at home, that may not be a good fit for your community. What does your community need and want? And how can you make that happen? So not doing something just for the sake of doing it, but really asking critically, how does this serve the needs of the patrons and the community?
Yes. Thank you. Alyssa.
My big thing is get to know your staff. The quicker you can find out what it is that they shine at individually, their individual quirks, and how it's best to communicate with them to get ideas across and how to receive ideas from them, everything else will fall into place so much quicker. And also never be afraid to ask for help. This is the one I really struggle with. Just because you have that management sticker slapped on you, you do not know everything. I'm sorry, but that's the cold hard truth. We all need help from time to time, and the quicker that you can learn that you do need to ask for help, again, the quicker everything will fall into place.
I always like to I tried to foster more of a team atmosphere. So just because I was the supervisor didn't mean that I was making all the decisions, didn't mean that I knew everything. You're absolutely right. And I leaned on my staff members to give me input and listen to me if I needed to bounce ideas off of somebody. So this is Beth, and my advice is just to try to remember that as a supervisor, you have two main goals. One, of course, is to lead your department in serving your community as best you can. But the other one is actually to create new leaders. So make sure you're giving your staff opportunities to build their skills. Like I said, ask for their input, treat them with respect. You can't do everything alone, as the others have said. So like I said, you have to build a team that works well together so that you can function well in your library. And I know that's easier said than done sometimes, but as a manager, you do also eventually get the chance to, if you're in that position for a while, kind of build your department yourself as people might leave or come and go. So just be looking for people that you can work well with. So that is all of our questions. Now we're looking for your questions, and I did have one other one from Bethany. She asked this earlier. She said, how do you provide support and guidance to staff during organizational change, like a new strategic plan? Has anyone encountered that? I will say we went through some strategic plan cycles at my old library, and I think getting buy-in from the staff by letting them give their input in the strategic plan process is a starting place for sure. Did you guys have something else?
This is Alyssa, and Casey and Cathy reminded me of this, even though it should be hard for me to forget. My library is getting ready to undergo a remodel and renovation. Yay, exciting times, yay, terrifying times. But the one big thing that's going to come out of this is we are going to become a combined circulation department. There will no longer be an adult circulation and a children's circulation staff. So currently the adult circ manager and I are working together to figure out some sort of plan for when we do this. A big part of the plan has been to say, I don't know, because right now we don't know what that's going to be like. So again, give yourself the freedom to say that, but also you have to reassure your staff that, one, we're not hiding things from you for some grand conspiracy theory outcome.
Right.
It's because we're truly trying to navigate uncharted waters. If you have something you need to say, now is the time to put your input in so we can try to figure it out. This job comes with a lot of reassuring and trying to keep everyone calm. As a person who does not do calm gracefully, that is hard. So again, the calmer you can keep in these types of situations, it will sort of help keep everyone else calm. Oh my gosh, Robert, you're sweet. This is fabulous.
Thank you.
Robert has just said this is easily one of the best and most helpful webinars I have had the pleasure to attend. Thank you.
Oh, thank you guys. Fran says, how do you manage interruptions? I find this to be one of my biggest challenges. Yes. Casey is getting up. She would like to address this.
Yes. Yes. Interruptions are a big part of it, and sometimes I wish that people understood that how much goes into, if I have a interaction or an issue with a patron, like that's a whole afternoon of writing up an incident report and discussing it with everyone involved and following up on things. I'm like, this is so much. I try to remind myself that of what I needed when I was not the manager, which is if I'm coming to your office, chances are I really, really, really need your attention. I also have to remind myself to take my hands off the computer keyboard and turn my chair and stay focused. It's a practice. And I would say that as a manager, that's one of my biggest challenges is how do I really focus on what people need. I'm also not really good at quote unquote landing the plane. So I'll start talking and then I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm still talking. So I have to practice like good interactions with staff members. An interruption generally, again, if I just try to be as empathetic as possible and put myself in the place of what I needed as an employee, if I went and interrupted my manager, it was for a good reason. And I just remember that sometimes I can just address it and be direct. And I can also set up a boundary. You know, if I need to not be interrupted, I can let my staff know I need, you know, the next hour uninterrupted, and they will respect that.
Yeah, I used to have I would put like a Post-it on my door. I would tell them in advance, like, hey, I'm working on evaluations or something like that. And then I would put a little note on the door just to remind people that's what I was doing. Or if I was in a webinar, I would put a little note that said I'm in a webinar, right?
This is Alyssa. For my staff, I tell them to interrupt me anytime, even though I'm probably the last person who should ever be interrupted from a task. But if there is something I really have to work on, annual report, employee evaluations, I have this very cute little picture of a chinchilla that goes on my closed door. And to the public, it just looks like, oh, cute chinchilla. My staff knows that if that sign is up, there needs to be blood, death, and a fire before you even think about knocking on my door. So occasionally you do have to set up a hard boundary like that. So if that would work for you, please put the chinchilla on your door.
If you know what a chinchilla is. All right. Do we have any other questions? Fran just says she's working on boundaries. Yeah, it's tough. I had to learn how to multitask and pick up drop a task and come back to it. And I don't think I ever perfected it, but making sure, also trying to, and this is easier said than done, but, we're talking about delegating. We're talking about giving other people responsibilities, not burning out. That also includes trying your hardest to build a little bit of time into your schedule each day, each week, where you can, if a task overflows because of an interruption, you still have time to get things done. And also to kind of, my leadership coach when I was at my old library said, you have to have time to vision for the future of your department. You need to take some of that time to be a leader in your department, and sometimes that means saying, my chinchilla's up. Casey.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add too that I have to make myself do this because I forget. I have to write it down. But get up out of your cubicle or office, get up out of your chair and walk around and talk to your staff. And talk to, I think sometimes the interruptions are they always have to come to me because I'm not getting up and going to them. So I always try to check in, say hello. And again, that was modeled for me by my director. So it's been good practice for me. Sometimes if I need to talk to somebody, I'll just get up and go to their area and sit down and chit chat. And that way it's not always them coming when I'm working in my office.
That is a really great point. Go to them. Erin wants to know, have you ever, did you have something to
It did.
Okay,
I do.
Cathy has one more thing in this.
And my staff, if you're listening, you know what I was doing. I was sitting back there thinking really hard because digging into that interruptions, that is something I struggle with because in our office, I do not have a separate office. I'm right there with the other 6 staff members. And I've had opportunities to get an office, but the benefits of being with my staff far outweigh the interruptions. So I go back and forth between being very good about saying, can this wait until we do our bi-weekly meeting? Or sort of looking by the expression on their face like, no, we need to address it right now. And I know sometimes I'm better at it than others because just recently this week I was running a program. I had everybody coming in and then I had somebody say, hey, the toilet in the women's restroom is overflowing. So then I am speed walking down the back hallway and somebody's trying to talk to me while I am frantically searching for our facilities. And what I was trying to do was listen while thinking about all the different ways I could fix the toilet. And I should have said, this is not a good time. Can I follow up with you later?
After I fix the toilet.
And they did even say, you seem to be in a hurry. And I was like, yes.
I will say that's one other thing I learned when I became a manager. I also became responsible for cleaning up vomit and toilet problems. So that's always fun.
Other duties as assigned.
Yes. So let's do one last question. I think we have time for one more, and we'll do Erin's because it is a really good and difficult question. Have you ever supervised a person who was your friend before, and how did that affect the other staff or your role? Does anybody run into that? I think most of us were promoted from within our libraries, so even if they weren't best friends with us, they were at least our colleagues for
Yeah, this is Casey. That's a great question. I have not supervised a friend before. I am getting ready to supervise someone that I have worked with in another capacity, and it's a little nerve-wracking because relationships are developed and then they're going to shift, and I'm not quite sure how, and that's a little overwhelming. I think employees will always, if other employees know about the friendship, they may be looking for validation that that person is getting special treatment.
Yes.
So I, as the manager, have to be extraordinarily cautious about optics, unfortunately. I think it is modeling that the expectations are the same all the way around. And the worst thing about cliques, I think, is when an administrator is part of a clique. And a previous friendship can set that up. So I think it can be done, and I think it can be done very successfully. I think it is the responsibility of the manager to maintain appropriate boundaries. And the focus is always on the expectations for the job, and is each employee meeting expectations.
And I would also say that it would probably be a good thing to have a conversation with that. If they're truly a friend, have a conversation with them when you take the job and say, look, I'm going to have to be impartial and be frank with them. Everybody else is going to be looking at us, like Casey said. And so we both need to be careful that I'm not playing favorites in this situation. It's hard. They're also the best people to work with, right? Because you have a good relationship with them. So hopefully it will go well, but just make sure they're not taking advantage also of that friendship. Anybody else have anything to add? Okay. All right, you guys. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. And I'm going to pull up now the place where you can download your LEU certificate. It's up at the top. The resources document is also there. It's a PDF. So what you do is highlight whichever document you would like. You click download file, and then on your computer you might have to give it some permissions or hit OK on something, just a heads up, before it will open up. Also, there is an evaluation. So the third box down in the middle says survey link. If you click on that, the thing that says evaluation : and then the Survey Monkey address, it will pop up in the browse to box, and then if you hit browse to, it'll take you to the website. Is it a little convoluted? Yes, I'm sorry, but that is the address right there. And then finally, my email address is at the bottom. So if you didn't get your question answered and you really would like advice, feel free to email me directly, and I can always outsource it to one of these ladies. But we wanted to make sure you know that there's also an informal youth services manager email list that was started by these three ladies when they did a similar presentation to this at the Youth Services Division Conference last fall. And so Cathy is managing that. So if you'd like to be added to that Youth Services Manager email list, her email address is at the bottom in that bottom box. It's criley@hcplibrary.org. But it's right down there. So since we're going to leave this up for a few minutes for people to download things, we did have, Bethany wants to know, is the YS manager list for Indiana folks only? Oh, she's in Nevada. Welcome, Bethany. Do you care? No, I don't think we care, right? Yeah. Because, the more the viewpoints, the better, probably, for giving advice. And then Sheila said, what are your thoughts on socializing as a department outside of work? My staff likes to get together, and the director is highly discouraging it. Ooh. I mean, I think it's fine for them to get together after work, right? Whether you join them is another story. It might depend on, if you're from a really small community. Casey has
well, and I was just going to, again, give a shout out to askamanager.com because she addresses these sorts of non-library specific questions really, really well. I'm just saying it's a really good resource because I think those sort of things happen. I would say if the director is highly discouraging it, there might be a reason for that.
Although I will say, I used to go to lunch occasionally with my colleagues, and I don't think there's anything wrong with going to lunch with people, especially if you're trying to make sure you're going to lunch with everybody in your department. You know, you don't want to maybe just always go with one person, especially if they used to be your friend and then you got promoted above them, as we were just talking about. Any other comments back here from my panel? They're all giving thoughtful faces. All right, well then we will wrap up, you guys. We're getting some thank yous. Again, there is a resources document and the LEU certificate at the top in the top box. The third box down is the survey, evaluation link, and then the bottom box has my email address as well as Cathy's if you'd like to be added to the Youth Services Manager email list. So we're gonna turn off our mic now, but I want to say thank you all. Thanks to my panel, Alyssa, Casey, and Cathy. I really appreciate them coming and sharing their institutional knowledge with us. And have a great day, everybody. Thanks.